other government officials, representatives from Taiwan office in the Republic of Somaliland, distinguished experts, academics, scholars, representatives of civil society organizations, and students. Ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor and privilege for me to welcome you on behalf of the University of Hargeisa and the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies to this interesting and timely topic, the changing American political landscape and its impact on the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea. Before I explain the importance of this topic briefly, I would like to extend my deep appreciation to our guest, Dr. Michael Rubin, for supporting Somaliland's case and his efforts to attain official recognition from the outside world. Dr. Rubin is devoted to defending Somaliland's case on international platforms, both verbally and written. The Somaliland citizens have been saying for decades, we are independent and we should have the same rights as other global citizens. Dr. Rubin is one of the very few scholars who say every day, yes, they deserve recognition and their case is legally binding in international law. And the international community should respect the rights of the Somaliland citizens. I am here to acknowledge his efforts on behalf of my institution, the University of Hargeisa. We greatly appreciate your efforts, your time, your patience, and efforts to advocate our case. This lecture is very important for us and for the citizens of this great nation, Somaliland, and also for the citizens of this fragile and volatile region, the Horn of Africa. Since independence, in the second half of the 20th century, the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea have been always globally contested areas. Why? Because of their strategic location and importance. Because of the diverse resources endowed with. The Horn of Africa is where the longest transboundary water, the Nile River, originates. It is one of the cradles of the human civilizations. The large-scale prehistoric caves and ancient rock art in Somaliland is a classic example. It is where the three Abrahamic religions are found: Islam, Christianity, and Jew. And it is where multi-ethnic groups are found, including very traditional society and groups. Apart from all those group factors, the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea are adjacent to the region which has the largest reserve of oil in the globe, the Middle Eastern region. The two regions have interwoven and intertwined histories, cultures, and religions. Because of all these attributes, the Horn of Africa has been caught between the competition of the superpowers of the day, the United States of America and the Soviet Union. Today, the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea are through the lens of competing global powers, such as Russia, which is reviving and trying to get a foothold on the region, and the Chinese, which arrived in the Horn of Africa and established its first ever military base in the Horn of Africa. Why? Because China wants to expand its sphere of influence to the African continent in general, and the Horn of Africa in particular. However, the question is, where is the United States of America in the current Horn of Africa politics? And what is its role in regards to the changing political dynamics of the Horn of Africa and the Red Sea, and its strategic importance from the age of Cold War to an era of war on terror? The answer emerges from our today's lecture. Without going into detail, I would like to welcome our guest speaker, Dr. Michael Rubin. Dr. Michael Rubin is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, where he specializes in Iran, Turkey, and the broader Middle East. He also regularly teaches classes at sea about Middle East conflicts, culture, terrorism, and the Horn of Africa. Dr. Rubin is the author, co-author, and co-editor of several books exploring diplomacy, Iranian history, Arab culture, Kurdish studies, and Shia politics. He earned his PhD and MA in history from Yale University in the United States. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Michael Rubin, to the stage.
Active in our foreign policy rather than proactive. I say that as an analyst rather than as an advocate, because if I could advocate, I would want the United States to have a much more coherent and comprehensive strategy, not just towards the Horn of Africa, but more broadly, globally. Sometimes presidents will say and undertake a strategy and announce a strategy, but then they will fail to carry it out. And that discrepancy, whether it's a lack of political will or whether it's dysfunction in the National Security Council, that discrepancy between what the rhetoric of our promise is and what our actual policy is sometimes misinterpreted as a lack of desire to do the right thing, when in fact anyone who's ever worked in Washington can understand just how chaotic policymaking is, where you have 200 people each trying to give mutually exclusive answers to what they want the United States to do. That said, what makes me slightly optimistic is while almost every president is elected for domestic political reasons with a mandate to focus on the United States domestically, President-elect Joseph Biden is the first president since George H.W. Bush was elected who has a deep foreign policy interest and background. And not only was Biden vice president, but before that, he had spent multiple terms as the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Likewise, the team which he is bringing in is also very dedicated to foreign policy. That doesn't mean they're dedicated to the Horn of Africa, however. Tony Blinken is very experienced, both as Biden's chief advisor in the Senate on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and Jake Sullivan, who will be the incoming national security advisor, is also very experienced and very interested in foreign policy, dating to his time as Secretary of State Clinton's, one of her chief advisors, and also as the policy planning director within the U.S. State Department. That said, even if Biden and his team are interested in foreign policy, if I can be blunt, the focus in the United States is, and it will continue to be, China, Russia, the Middle East, and Iran. We are going to become interested in the Horn of Africa if something happens in the Horn of Africa that leads us in our reactive policy to be drawn more closely into the region. Now, on a day-to-day basis, if the Secretary of State is focused, or the National Security Advisor is focused on China or Russia or the Middle East, then who is in charge of policy in the Horn of Africa? And what you end up having in situations like this is the policy being determined and carried out at the Assistant Secretary of State level or at the ambassadorial level. The U.S. ambassador to Russia or the U.S. ambassador to China doesn't make policy. They carry it out because the policy is made above them. But the U.S. ambassador to Somalia, in effect, is the one making policy in Somalia because very few other people are paying attention. Now, that can be both good and that can be bad. And we can cover some of that as we move forward further. If the ambassador says, well, you have to do what I say because that's what Washington wants. Realistically, no one in Washington is probably even reading his reports. And so that itself is a little bit of a bluff. But that said, he has the power to prevent other people from becoming involved in policy or from changing the direction of policy. Now, when it comes to the United States' position toward the Horn of Africa, given all the caveats I've already mentioned, specifically that at the highest levels of the US government, there really isn't that much interest at present. The fact of the matter is that those who are most interested in the Horn of Africa right now are the US military. And they're interested in the Horn of Africa just because as they plan and as they look 10 years in the future, they will see they will see both opportunities and necessities which they want to have open to them. That doesn't mean, of course, an invasion. The military is just one component of strategy. When the United States, when they teach strategy at US military academies, for example, they will teach that every strategy has 4 main components. They call it the DIME model. D for diplomacy, I for information, M for military, E for economic. And the understanding is that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So for any coherent strategy, you need to have diplomats, military, economists, and those involved in information all working together hand in hand. That isn't necessarily the case in the United States right now. But the military will look at great power competition. They will understand that our major base in Africa, from which we carry out counterterrorism operations and other operations far beyond Africa, is in Djibouti. And yet China has now, as we heard in the introduction, opened its first overseas military base there, and more importantly, invests more than 10 times what the United States invests in Djibouti. If China ever told the Djiboutian government, we want Washington to go, I doubt, given the debt trap which Djibouti finds itself in, and many other African countries find themselves in, that Djibouti would keep the United States lease at Camp Lejeune. And so the military is aware of this and is looking at contingencies. What are possible contingencies? Number one contingency, of course, would simply be using our amphibious assault ships, so-called LHDs, which are like small aircraft carriers. They're the ones that fly the Ospreys, the F-35 Joint Strike Fighters, and helicopters. But why did the French originally colonize Djibouti in the first place, or the British colonize Aden? It was as a coaling port, as a supply port, and the fact of the matter is, you can't simply operate without having a place for resupply. Not everything can be resupply at sea. And that leaves open the question of Berbera, which of course many in the Pentagon are increasingly interested in, and older folks within the Pentagon actually have memories of from the tail end of the Cold War. Now, I also need to say that when it comes to the US military, and I used to work in the Defense Department, but I never served in the military. I was strictly a civilian. The US military has no desire to be in the Persian Gulf. Now, we often hear about American ships in the Persian Gulf, especially vis-a-vis Iran. But from a strategic and historical point of view, we don't want to be there. From a strategic point of view, the reason we don't want to be in the Persian Gulf is the Persian Gulf is extremely narrow and extremely shallow. At its greatest depth, the Persian Gulf is only 100 meters deep. Now, when you consider that the Persian Gulf isn't an open body of water, but actually has islands within it, those islands, of course, have territorial waters. What that means is that the shipping lanes are very, very narrow in the Persian Gulf. And so the Americans feel vulnerable when they are there, especially when they look at Iran, which with speedboats or unmanned aerial vehicles could attack American ships. Up until 1991, we seldom, if ever, put a U.S. aircraft carrier in the Persian Gulf. Between 1991 and 2003, on average, we had one aircraft carrier in the Gulf at all times. Between 2003 and 2011, on average, we had 2 aircraft carriers. And at this point in time, the United States only has 11 total, more than half of which are in port or being refueled or such at any time. I'm sorry to go into the weeds, but I figure I would give more detailed analysis since it's an academic audience. What this means is that by being in the Persian Gulf, we're not only vulnerable, but we're not elsewhere where we might want to be. If I talk to any retired admiral, and when I'm talking to admirals and retired admirals, I talk to them because they're the ones that will speak openly and honestly. They're no longer in service. What they would say is, we can be in the Northern Indian Ocean. We can do every mission we need to do from the Northern Indian Ocean without suffering the vulnerability. If you have a strategic posture like that, the Pentagon thinking goes, instead of working at Jebel Ali in the United Arab Emirates, why not work at some place like Berber, which has an airfield, which has an upgraded port, deep water port, and which we've used in the past. Now, I would argue that despite the lack of U.S. engagement in Africa, the moment right now is Somaliland's, and the future is increasingly looking bright for Somaliland. Now, we heard about international law and legal arguments about Somaliland, but again, if I can be honest, most Americans in Washington don't particularly care about international law. It's much more of, a European obsession. And it's also fair to say that when it comes to international law, most people who quote international law will quote it in such a way that they forget that the very basis of law is about argument and precedent, and there's seldom one interpretation of international law. That said, I find Somaliland's legal case to be compelling. And even if one doesn't want to look at the 1960 independence as the precedent, the fact that Somaliland, unlike many other would-be independent states, has actually had its borders determined by treaty over the past 100 years is important. But let me move beyond international law. When I say that the moment is Somaliland's, it's not just because of the positive aspects of Somaliland, it's because, unfortunately, of where the rest of the region is going. If I can be so blunt, it appears that both Somalia and Ethiopia are unraveling. In Somalia, and both countries, of course, may have this unraveling catalyzed or exacerbated by forthcoming elections. In Somalia, I would argue that one of the reasons why Somalia is unraveling is because of the mistaken approach of the United States and some other members of the international community. There was a belief, and this has been underlying the strategy of our current ambassador, Donald Yamamoto, that the way to rebuild Somalia from its post-Siad Barre state failure is to actually channel resources through Mogadishu. And through the channeling of resources in Mogadishu, build up patronage, which then the leader in Mogadishu, the president in Mogadishu, could use in order to consolidate control over the country. Unfortunately, that sort of strategy has had the opposite effect because it has greased some of the corruption, and some of that money which was meant to contribute to the counter-terror fight appears to be applied more to countering political opponents than to actually fighting al-Shabaab. We can talk about that more in questions and answers. Suffice to say, we've seen with yesterday's announcement of the unilateralism of some of the forthcoming elections, with some states simply not participating, that it's not hard to see that there is going to be some serious political disputes in the future, and those political disputes could turn military. With regard to Ethiopia, we also have the situation with regard to Tigray. One of the things I worry about, I'm a historian by training, which means I get paid to predict the past. And admittedly, my critics would say I only get that right 50% of the time. But what I worry about when it comes to Abiy Ahmed in Ethiopia is that many of the people who come in as reformers, not just in Africa, but we've seen this in Africa repeatedly, will transform into something other than reformers. We've seen this with Isaias in Eritrea. We saw this with Mugabe in Zimbabwe, and so forth. Power can be addicting, and crises can be self-sustaining. Now, while a real argument can be made that the ethnic federalism of the 1995 Constitution in Ethiopia was not the solution for Ethiopia, the fact of the matter is, to unilaterally abrogate that Constitution isn't the process through which the situation can be resolved. There's legal ways to resolve that. And when we see military moves into Tigray, unfortunately, when one opens that door, it's very easy for other states to get involved. It's very easy to create take what appears to be a quick victory and not recognize that you're setting the stage for a long-term, low-intensity conflict, which is going to erode Ethiopia economically at a time when Ethiopia is already facing some serious economic troubles. We also have transitions looming in Eritrea, although no Eritrean would want to talk about that. Isaias is quite elderly, and he's rumored to have had a stroke, I believe, last April. Regardless, there's going to be a day when Isaias doesn't wake up. And then the question is his son popular enough with the military in order to consolidate control? Would other states interfere in Eritrea? And there's any numbers of other possibilities. So Eritrean stability is up in dispute. Sudan, of course, is undergoing a political transition. In my view, it's a positive political transition, but it's far from certain that that political transition is going to be able to solidify in a way where we know what Sudan is going to look like 10 years from now. South Sudan, one doesn't even need to, I mean, the situation is known to all of you. Now, when we look at that and we compare it, we juxtapose it with Somaliland. Somaliland is a clear success, and it's been one since 1991. While elections might be destabilizing in Ethiopia, simply because there's no real opposition at this point in time, and in Somalia, because there's too much opposition at this point in time. In Somaliland, in all likelihood, the elections are going to go smoothly, and it's going to be a good news story. Now, this is where the stars might align again for the United States and Somaliland. Washington is a very cynical place. And oftentimes, when the situation, I mean, American diplomats and American officials like to claim credit for everything that's good and avoid blame for everything that goes wrong. And most of the things we claim credit for have nothing to do with us. I mean, we have a new president every 4 or 8 years, and every president will claim that what happens during those 4 or 8 years is because of them. It's not true, but it's a fiction that most Americans live under. Well, what we often find is that when problems occur, American officials will try to find a good news story and attach themselves to it. So, for example, if we look back at the Horn of Africa just about 8 years ago, it was against the backdrop of chaos in Libya and the tragedy of the American consulate in Benghazi. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was looking for a success story because people were starting to criticize her, and she had, at that time, presidential ambitions. They were starting to criticize her as someone who hadn't achieved anything as Secretary of State. And so she turned to Somalia. And the development of the transitional government in Somalia and really attached herself to it. So too did Secretary of State John Kerry, her successor, when he made his 2015 visit to Mogadishu. Well, if you have problems in Somalia, if you have problems in Ethiopia, what better way, if you're a politician, to show that the United States is still able to have success stories than actually become more involved with Somaliland? Now, against this issue, if Somalia does enter a period of chaos as these elections approach, Yamamoto's strategy of centralizing all assistance is probably going to be revised. Yamamoto is nearing retirement. I don't know when he will retire, but I suspect it will be soon after the elections. And when you have new, fresh faces who are looking at the region, they might say the strategy we tried for the last 5 years hasn't worked, so let's try a much more regional approach, one that, again, Somaliland can take advantage of. More broadly, I just want to highlight that while the United States isn't fully interested in the Horn of Africa right now, that the Red Sea region is a region which the United States is increasingly involved in, at least in a naval capacity, and which we're not ready to ignore. In 2018, according to the Energy Information Agency of the United States, 6.2 million barrels per day of oil went through the Red Sea, went through the Bab el-Mandeb. Much of that was, about 40% of that was heading onwards to the Suez Canal. The other 60% was actually traffic going the other direction. Now, while in Washington, we often, and in Europe, environmentalists often talk about divorcing ourselves from fossil fuels, the simple fact is if you look at a world map and you draw a circle around India and China, more people live within that circle than live outside that circle. And when you consider the aftermath of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan, you have a return to a dependence on fossil fuels and a turn away from nuclear energy and some other alternative energies. And because of that, this maritime trade and these sea routes are going to remain crucially important. If we want to look more further, $700 billion worth of goods get shipped through the Red Sea annually. And so this, of course, is a trade that isn't going to be ignored and is going to maintain that U.S. naval presence in the region. And again, I come back to the key, I think, for the United States to become more involved in the Horn of Africa, and specifically Somaliland, is the U.S. Navy. And that goes, again, into the issue of Berbera. It also economically involves the corridors, which need to be talked about. I find it regretful that China competes for influence in Africa. India does. Turkey and Iran do. Taiwan is, and yet the United States is absent without leave, given, cynically speaking, the economic potential of Africa. Over the last 20 or 30 years, more than 2 billion people have been lifted out of abject poverty. They've been lifted out of poverty in East Asia, in Southeast Asia, and in Africa by an embrace generally of free market capitalism. The economies across Africa have boomed. And the corridor, given the population of Ethiopia, given the strategic importance of the Horn of Africa, the corridors into the interior of Africa are going to be hugely economically important, and that's something which the United States might be late to the game on, but isn't going to forever escape our attention. Lastly, I'll just highlight, of course, the great power competition. China is, every conversation with serious strategic thinkers in Washington involves China and the threat from China. Honestly, personally, I'm more worried about the decline of China than I am about the rise of China. And when I say that, it may seem counterintuitive, but because of the one-child policy which occurred for decades in China, they're nearing a demographic precipice where their population is aging. Demographically, they're not going to have as many young people who are going to be able to replace them. That's going to create economic strains, and so I worry about China lashing out militarily in order to cover its economic decline. At the same time, Russia, I don't see as, it tries to be an actor in this region. I don't see it as much of one. And India, I see, as with Taiwan, to be a very positive actor. The Taiwan move, by the way, which the establishment, the exchange of offices and relations between Taiwan and Somaliland is incredibly important. It's great news. I wrote this before I realized our Taiwanese friends were going to be here. So this is sincere. It's not me being diplomatic, because I'm not. It's hugely important, hugely appreciated, and I think it really also changes the dynamic, and it catches the attention not only of the United States, but other democracies. And so I would certainly hope that the Biden administration will do all that's necessary to keep that relationship on track and support its expansion. With that, I've laid out a number of different issues, but just to summarize it, the dark clouds on the horizon is I see a great deal of instability coming to the Horn of Africa. The silver lining is that Somaliland is going to be an exception to that. The question then becomes, can the United States recognize the opportunities which are presented in a proactive way, or are we going to wait until act more reactively? In deference to our British friends, let me just end by quoting Winston Churchill and what he said about the United States. Of course, what he said is the United States always does the right thing. They just try everything else first. So hopefully we can defy Winston Churchill's logic there as we move forward in our relationship. And with that, thank you very much.